Hello everyone, this is Devasri. Welcome to you to the journey of literature. Friends, it's my talk on the preface to the Lyrical Ballad Part-3, in where I will try my level best to clear the concept of lyrical ballads and the poetry is the language of common people, and Samuel Taylor Coleridge was the first critics to find faults with the Wordsworth theory of diction and how he exposes its many weaknesses. Without wasting too much time, let's start our topic. Before I start, very quickly remind you about the lyrical ballad that a collaboration of Coleridge and Wordsworth got published in 1798, and the second edition of lyrical ballad got published in 18th century, and the third edition of it got published in 1802. Wordsworth's preface to lyrical ballads has been called a manifesto of romanticism. In lyrical ballads, Wordsworth wanted to express his theory of poetry. The preface is therefore a justification of that theory and of the themes and styles of the poems in lyrical ballads. So, as we discuss the theory of poetry, so what Wordsworth tries to define poetry in his preface to the lyrical ballads, that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotions recollected in a tranquility. To examine the concept in the preface to the lyrical ballads, one aspect of this theory was to use themes about the common life. Thus, Wordsworth wanted to explore how one could attain the profound truths and sublime emotional experience via the imagination. In the other words, we can say this process is about the understanding the extraordinary while expressing the ordinary. Poetry is to be created out of these extraordinary or the ordinary experiences. Poetry will be the spontaneous overflow of emotions that reflected in tranquility. The process of experience or feelings and the reflections is not just a method for the poetic creations. It is also the Wordsworth's recommended method for experience in general. In the concept of the lyrical ballads, the point to be noticed is Wordsworth wanted to the style of lyrical ballads to stick with the common life theme. He proposed to avoid the personifications and the traditional poetic diction. One could easily argue that a poem or the song has a longer life in the memory than a passage from a work of prose. This is not just because a poem tends to be a shorter work, but it's also because of the kindness in the rhythm, natural mnemonic devices also. Poems about realistic common people in rustic environments. Wordsworth was rejecting the poetry of the past, which tended to treat kings, queens, and heroes in an overly regimented style. For Wordsworth, real people were more relevant. More to the point of Wordsworth believed that sublime emotions can be discovered in the experience and the reflections of common experiences. In other words, it can be inspiring to identify extraordinary virtue in a poem about an extraordinary hero whose exploits are unbelievable to the point of being legendary. To conclude my discussion on the concept of lyrical ballad, was supposed that it would also be inspiring, more relevant, and more rewarding to identify the extraordinary virtue in a poem about ordinary life. To focus the point I'm going to discuss, poetry is the language of common people. How? Let's see. Wordsworth continued to revise the preface in the hope of gaining a larger reading audience and further recognition by the other writers. He rejects previous conventional approaches to the literature as emotionally barren, overlooking the connection he values between the thoughts and language of common people and the poet's ability to transmit the experience at the same accessibility level. He speaks of poetry as existing from the poet as one person to other person, with no intermediary needed. He recognizes some refinement of anything considered the vulgar or the offensive would need exist. As a romanticism, Wordsworth values the humble, rustic ways of country folk, people who he believes have directly experienced the truth of nature. Their experiences can be transmitted in poetry that includes the same honesty and directness that finds in homogeneous rural settings. He created the poems spring from overflow of genuine feelings, but this lead to reflection and simple wisdom, and then are restated in ordinary language to recreate the original emotions. I presume on the concept of common people language that Pope and Genesis among the British poets whose preface was rejected just because of her look on the lives of common people, the Jew speaks the humble and unadorned language. So, poetry is the most prominent part of the language of common people. To focus the third point in our discussion, that Samuel Taylor Coleridge was the first critic to find fault with the Wordsworth theory of diction and how expose its many weaknesses. Let's see. Number 1. Language. He argues that a language so selected and purified as Wordsworth's recommendtions would differ in no way from the language of any other man of common sense. After such a selections, there would be no differences between the rustic language and the language used by men in other walks of life. Number 2. Meter. Wordsworth permits the use of meter, and this implies a particular order and arrangement of words. Meter indicates the whole atmospheres, and the language of poetry is bound to differ from that of a prose. So, Coleridge concludes that there is an essential difference between the language of prose and that of poetry because of meter. The use of meter is as artificial as the use of poetic diction, and if one is allowed, it is absurd to forbid the use of others. Both are equally good sources of poetic pleasures. Number 3. Coleridge objects to the use of the word real, quoted, and expresses the views that it should be substituted or replaced by the ordinary. It's not correct that the best words of a English language derived from the nature. The best words are derived from the reflective acts of the mind. If a poet wants to use the rustic language, he must also think like the rustics also. The language of rustics is curiously inexpressive. To a clear understanding, we can say that in writing of poetry, Wordsworth has chosen the incidents and situations from humble and rustic life. He also asks to adapt the language of the people in rural life. Friends, this is all about my talk on the preface to the Lyrical Ballad Part 3. Finally, we can say a landmark of literary criticism, Lyrical Ballad by Wordsworth is an epoch-making contribution to the English literature. Before my talk on Lyrical Ballad Part 3, I already shared 2 videos on lyrical ballads. If you want to see, that link is in the description box. So if you have any objections, please put it in the comment sections. God bless you. Thank you.